Yesterday he had been too flustered to do anything of the kind. Just before tea time, there came a tremendous ring on the front doorbell, and then he remembered. He rushed and put on the kettle and put out another cup and saucer and an extra cake or two, and ran to the door. "I am so sorry to keep you waiting," he was going to say, when he saw that it was not Gandalf at all. It was a dwarf with a blue beard tucked into a golden belt, very bright eyes under his dark green hood. As soon as the door was opened, he pushed inside just as if he had been expected. He hung his hooded cloak on the nearest peg, and "Dwellin at your service," he said, with a low bow. "Bilbo Baggins at yours," said the Hobbit, too surprised to ask any questions for the moment. When the silence that followed had become uncomfortable, he added, "I am just about to take tea. Pray come and have some with me." A little stiff perhaps, but he meant it kindly. "And what would you do if an uninvited dwarf came and hung his things up in your hall without a word of explanation?" They had not been at the table long. In fact, they had hardly reached the third cake when there came another even louder ring at the bell. "Excuse me," said the Hobbit, and off he went to the door. "So you've got here at last." That was what he was going to say to Gandalf this time, but it was not Gandalf. Instead, there was a very old-looking dwarf on the step with a white beard and a scarlet hood, and he too hopped inside as soon as the door was open, just as if he had been invited. "I see they've begun to arrive already," he said, when he caught sight of Dwalin's green hood hanging up. He hung his red one next to it, and "Balin at your service," he said with his hand on his breast. "Thank you," said Bilbo. It was not the correct thing to say, but "they have begun to arrive" had flustered him badly. He liked visitors, but he liked to know them before they arrived, and he preferred to ask them himself. He had a horrible thought that the cakes might run short, and then he, as the host, and he knew his duty and stuck to it however painful, he might have to go without. "Come along in and have some tea," he managed to say after taking a deep breath. "A little beer would suit me better, if it's all the same to you, my good sir," said Balin with the white beard, "but I don't mind some cake. Seed cake if you have any." "Lots," Bilbo found himself answering, to his own surprise, and he found himself scuttling off too to the cellar to fill a pint beer mug, and then to the pantry to fetch 2 beautiful round seed cakes, which he had baked that very afternoon for his after-supper morsel. When he got back, Balin and Dwalin were talking at the table like old friends, and as a matter of fact they were brothers. Bilbo plumped down the beer and the cake in front of them, when a loud ring came at the bell again, and then another ring. Gandalf was certain this time, he thought, as he puffed along the passage, but it was not. It was 2 more dwarfs, both with blue hoods, silver belts, and yellow beards, and each of them carried a bag of tools and a spade. In they hopped as soon as the door began to open, and Bilbo was hardly surprised at all. "What can I do for you, my dwarfs?" he said. "Gilly at your service," said one, and Filly added the other, and they both swept off their blue hoods and bowed. "At yours and your families," replied Bilbo, remembering his manners this time. "Dwalin and Balin here already, I see," said Gilly. "Let us join the throng." "Throng," thought Mr. Baggins, just had a sip in the corner, whilst the four dwarfs sat round the table and talked about mines and gold and troubles with the goblins and the depredations of dragons and lots of other things which he did not understand and did not want to, for they sounded much too adventurous, when the bell rang again, as if some naughty little hobbit boy was trying to pull the handle off. "Someone at the door," he said. "Some four, I should say by the sound," said Philly. "Besides, we saw them coming along behind us in the distance." The poor little hobbit sat down in the hall and put his head in his hands and wondered what had happened and what was going to happen and whether they would all stay to supper. Then the bell rang again louder than ever, and he had to run to the door. It was not four after all, it was five. Another dwarf had come along whilst he was wandering in the hall. He had hardly turned the knob before they were all inside, bowing and saying actual service one after the other. Dorry, Norry, Orry, Oin and Gloin were their names, and very soon 2 purple hoods, a grey hood, a brown hood, and a white hood were hanging on the pegs, and off they marched with their broad hands stuck in their gold and silver belts to join the others. Already it had almost become a throng. Some called for ale, some for porter, one for coffee, and all of them for cakes, and so the hobbit was kept very busy for a while. A big jug of coffee had just been set in the hearth. The seed cakes were gone, and the dwarfs were starting on a round of buttered scones, when there came a loud knock, not a ring, but a hard rat-tat-tat-tat on the hobbit's beautiful green door. Somebody was banging with a stick. Bilbo rushed along the passage very angry, and altogether bewildered and bewildered. This was the most awkward Wednesday he ever remembered. He pulled open the door with a jerk, and they all fell in, one on top of the other. 4 dwarfs, 4 more, and there was Gandalf behind, leaning on his stick and laughing. He'd made quite a dent on the beautiful door. He had also, by the way, knocked out the secret mark that he put there the morning before. "Carefully, carefully," he said. "It is not like you, Bilbo, to keep friends waiting on the mat and then open the door like a popgun. Let me introduce Bifur, Bofur, Bomber, and especially Thorin." "At your service," said Bifur, Bofur, and Bomber, standing in a row. Then they hung up 2 yellow hoods and a pale green one, and also a sky blue one with a long silver tassel. The last belonged to Thorin, an enormously important dwarf. In fact, no other than the great Thorin Oakenshield himself, who was not at all pleased at falling flat on Bilbo's mat with Bifur, Bofur, and Bomber on top of him. But one thing, Bomber was immensely fat and heavy. Thorin indeed was very haughty, and said nothing about service, but poor Mr. Baggins said he was sorry so many times that at last he grunted, "Pray don't mention it," and stopped frowning. "Now we are all here," said Gandalf, looking at the row of 13 hoods, and his own hat hanging on the pegs. "Quite a merry gathering. I hope there's something left for the latecomers to eat and drink. What's that? Tea? No, thank you. A little red wine, I think, for me." "And for me," said Thorin. "And raspberry jam and apple tart," said Bifur. "And mince pies and cheese," said Bofur. "And pork pie and salad," said Bomber. "And more cakes and ales and coffee, if you don't mind," called the other dwarfs through the door. "Put on a few eggs, there's a good fellow," Gandalf called after him, as the hobbit stumped off to the pantries. "And just bring out the cold chicken and much about the inside of my larders as I do myself, thought Mr. Baggins, who was feeling positively flummoxed, and he was beginning to wonder whether a most wretched adventure had not come right into his house. By the time he got all the bottles and dishes and knives and forks and glasses and plates and spoons and things piled up on big trays, he was getting very hot and red in the face and annoyed. "Confusticate and bebother these dwarfs," he said aloud. "Why don't they come and lend a hand?" And lo and behold, there stood Balin and Dwalin at the door of the kitchen, and Philly and Gilly behind them, and before he could say knife, they had whisked the trays and a couple of small tables into the parlour and set everything out afresh. Gandalf sat at the head of the party, with the 13 dwarfs all around, and Bilbo sat on a stool at the fireside, nibbling at a biscuit, because his appetite was quite taken away, and trying to look as if this was all perfectly ordinary, and not in the least an adventure. The dwarfs ate and ate, and talked, and time got on. At last, they pushed their chairs back, and Bilbo made a move to collect the plates and glasses. "I suppose you will all stay to supper," he said in his politest, unsuppressing tones. "Of course," said Thorin, "and after. We shan't get through the business till late, and we must have some music first. Now clear up." Thereupon the 12 dwarfs, but not Thorin, he was too important and stayed talking to Gandalf, jumped to their feet and made tall piles of all the things. Off they went, not waiting for trays, balancing columns of plates, each with a bottle at the top, with one hand, whilst the Hobbit ran after them, almost squeaking with fright, "Please be careful," and "Please don't trouble, I can manage." But the dwarves only started to sing. Chip the glasses and crack the plates, blunt the knives and bend the forks. That's what Bilbo Baggins hates. Smash the bottles and burn the corks. Cut the cloth and tread on the fat. Pour the milk on the pantry floor. Leave the bones on the bedroom mat. Splash the wine on every door. Dump the crocs in a boiling bowl. Pound them up with a thumping bowl. And when you've finished, if any are whole, send them down the hall to roll. That's what Bilbo Baggins hates. So carefully with the plates. And of course, they did none of these dreadful things, and everything was cleaned and put away safe and as quick as lightning, while the Hobbit was turning round and round in the middle of the kitchen, trying to see what they were doing. Then they went back and found Thorin with his feet on the fender smoking a pipe. He was blowing the most enormous smoke rings, and whenever he told one to go, it went up the chimney, behind the clock on the mantelpiece, under the table, or round and round the ceiling. But wherever it went, it was not quick enough to escape Gandalf. Pop! He sent a smaller smoke ring from his short clay pipe straight through each one of Thorin's. Then Gandalf's smoke ring would go green and come back to hover over the wizard's head. He had a cloud of them about him already, and in the dim light it made him look strange and sorcerous. Bilbo stood still and watched, and blushed to think how proud he had been yesterday of the smoke